So hi and welcome to our new technical webinar, which is around ELTIF 2, A Bright Future Ahead. That's really a very promising title, and that's why I'm today here with Silke Bernard, partner at Linklaters, and Ronn Henry from Partners Group, in order then to share those great news. ELTIF 2, that's really a good topic because that in our eyes symbolizes good and smart regulation. So the European Commission taking the decision to revamp the ELTIF 1, which was not really a huge success, in order to make it more appropriate, to make it also more accessible to some of the practitioners, and potentially then to develop that kind of new opportunities for the European market. And from that perspective, thanks to good talks with the industry, with Invest Europe and some other practitioners, the result looks very promising, and we'll be shortly with you in order then to have those different elements shared and featured. The other element we think is very key and important for the future, it's ELTIF 2 could be a very nice and positive tool for the democratization of the private markets and assets. That's why we should really look into that, embrace it, be a front runner as a Luxembourg Fund Hub, and see how far it will bring us in that direction. So without further ado, I will now pass on to Silke and Ron in order then to guide you and navigate you through the new features of ELTIF.
Thank you very much, Stefan. I want to start?
Cool. Sure. Thank you, Stefan, and welcome everyone. Just a brief introduction. I'm Ronn Henry. I'm a structuring professional working within the semi-liquids group at Partners Group, where I focus specifically on open-ended fund initiatives. And I'll introduce Silke.
Thank you. So, hi everybody. Thanks for joining. My name is Silke Bernard. I'm partner in the funds group at Linklaters. I think the idea of this webinar came up because both Ron and I have been dealing with the ELTIFs that are the most long-standing ELTIFs in the market, set up in 2016, and I think it's also the first retail ELTIFs across Europe, the ones that are really coming now almost to an end. Working on a number of successor funds. So yeah, we wanted to share with you some of the insights, some of our experience with ELTIFs over the last 8 years, and also give you an insight in what is coming, what is improving, and it's very bright, as the name of the webinar says, very bright future ahead. So really looking forward.
And we have, so again, we'll focus on what's transpired, what's happening now, and what's to come. And we've just handpicked a few select topics that we think are relevant for the industry. So we won't go into a broad overview of the changes that are coming, but more specifically those changes which tie nicely into, again, the democratization theme.
Yes, so let's start with where do we stand? Evie, would you mind going on the timeline we have in our slides? It's slide number 2. I think in the PDF it may be 3. So we tried to put together a bit of a timeline where we stand, starting from the first ELTIF regulation, which was published in December 2015. The first ELTIFs, as said, were launched in Luxembourg in 2016. Now there has been like a bit more like a year of very heavy discussions between the European lawmakers, who, as Stefan said before, have really listened to the industry, have been very interested in hearing experiences, what were the obstacles, why did ELTIF not really take off as expected. So I think the last time I looked at the numbers, they are updated quarterly. We had like 84 or so ELTIFs in Europe, the majority of which in Luxembourg. So when we are talking about Luxembourg as a ELTIF hub, I think we don't need to be shy. We have the majority of ELTIFs, and I think the market has been very receptive to it. I am thinking that probably the numbers will tick up now, but they have not been a huge success so far. So they wanted to really understand what has happened, why it was not accepted by the industry and by sponsors. They have listened for a year or so. They've come up with a proposal. And in November, there was a final agreement reached between the European lawmakers, we are now, I just checked yesterday, apparently the final vote in the European Parliament is expected to take place next Tuesday, Valentine's Day, nice gift. So by then it will be formal, adopted, and so on. Then it will be published. There will be a 20 days waiting period, and then it will be like the official adopted text. On the next slide, we have put what is probably one of the most interesting things for everybody right now. When will it be available? We have the date of application, which is like the date of publication plus 20 days, and we have 9 months. After that, there will be, I think I'm jumping, right? So after that, you will have 4 ELTIFs that are still in fundraising, a 5 years grandfathering period to adopt to the new rules if you wish to. If you're no longer in fundraising, you don't need to adapt. That's fine. You can stay as you are. And what is very interesting and very new is that there is an early opt-in possibility. So ELTIFs that are still in fundraising or in the approval process, they can opt into the new rules even before that 9 months waiting period. So that is really interesting. However, Ronn, from a sponsor's view, there are a few points still to come.
Yeah, I mean, it's been 7 years, right? It's been a long time to wait for an update, and a much needed one. And I think the updates that we're seeing now, essentially, again, will hopefully result in an increase in the interest in the product. The one thing, though, that is pending, and that's that 9-month runway that you see there on the screen, is ESMA's guidance. And ESMA's guidance will focus primarily on the liquidity management aspects of the ELTIF program. So namely the minimum holding periods, the matching provisions that are available. Those tie in directly with how managers think about constructing an ELTIF. What are the liquidity provisions that they can offer, if any? What are the asset classes that they can feature into it as far as portfolio construction goes? So I think the changes are positive, but again, some, let's say, more critical aspects still need to be clarified by ESMA in the months to come.
Yes, and we will come to that in a bit to run you a little bit through what will be coming. That will be towards the end of our presentation. Also, there are some technical questions like what about countries like Norway, which are not part of the European Union, but they have adopted the ELTIF 1.0 legislation by some committee decision. Will it automatically upgrade to the new rules? I understand from some research we've done that there needs to be another committee decision. So yeah, a few points still to come, but I think it's quite positive, and we are now planning to run you a little bit through the biggest changes.
Yeah, you could just skip to the next slide.
That's slide 6, please, the pink one. So we have selected a few topics, which you can see here on the screen. It's not exhaustive. There are many more points and some technical points as well. So we didn't mean to be exhaustive, but we wanted to give you a flavor of the great new things that are coming, and maybe also some of the questions that remain. So Ronn will give, of course, the asset management view of things. I'm more like the legal person. So we will together try to give you a bit of a flavor. So the first very interesting tool, and which has been one of the obstacles in the past, was the risk diversification. So in the past, we had a diversification requirement of not more than 10% into one long-term asset. That has been a little bit difficult for a number of fund sponsors to achieve, because typically they have like 20% or something else, but 10, that would have required changes to operational systems and so on. So many have shied away from ELTIF. Now that has changed. The new requirement is 20% for ELTIFs sold to retail investors, and we will come later to some carve-outs for professional investor ELTIFs. So that is much more realistic. So you would need like an average 5 long-term assets to to build an overall ELTIF portfolio, of course, not counting liquidity assets and so on. So Ron, what is a look-through?
And maybe if you could skip to slide 8, please. Yep, there we go. That's it. Sorry, that one. Yeah, just go back one for me. So as mentioned by Silke again, I mean the expansion, right? So you go from this 10% requirement to what is essentially now, I mean, essentially you can view it as a 30-20-10 rule, where essentially you have a 30% limit on the concentration of units or shares, which the ELTIF then holds in other UCITS or EUAs. And then a requirement, again, as it relates to 20% of the capital in units of shares in any single ELTIF or UCITS or EUAF. And I think the key takeaway I'd like for you to take away from this slide is, again, what's happened is the expansion of the qualified portfolio undertakings, right? So this now includes UCITS and AIFs specifically, whereas this wasn't a provision in the 1.0 rules. That being said, it does come with, again, these limitations, right? The 30, the 20, and the 10. And the 10 is I think, where managers will probably pay particular attention to, because it essentially requires that when you do invest into a UCITS or an EUAF, that target investment does not itself hold more than 10% of its assets in another UCI. So I think generally the industry struggles with, how is that qualification determined? Is it done based on how prescriptive the target fund's fund documentation is, or do you adopt a look-through, right? And it is a look-through that may require some, let's say, mental gymnastics, just to figure out, again, at what point do you stop, and is that fund actually complying with those requirements?
Well, I think the great news here is, and I think Stefan, you mentioned it at the beginning, is that target funds are now eligible. In the past, they were not, or only UCITS, UVICs, and other ELTIFs, which was pretty unrealistic. Now they are eligible, and I think that's really great news, and that will very much open ELTIFs to a much larger public. I think retail investors in certain countries, they are really used to like these fund of fund or basket or however you call it solutions. They like that because you can very quickly get access to a whole existing portfolio of underlying assets. And that is something that works really well. So it's not ideal, as you said, you cannot go into whatever Delaware, Cayman or whatever funds, but you can go in a number of target funds and you can very quickly build a portfolio. So that is one of the really great news under the new regulation, that we can do fund of funds, although you have these look-through questions and you need to avoid circumvention and so on.
Good. Maybe could we skip to the next slide, please, slide 8. And here again, so as mentioned, so now with the expansion of, I'll use the acronym QPU, so Qualified Portfolio Undertaking. It essentially means you can build, feeder ELTIFs, master ELTIFs, fund of funds, essentially again, because you have the capacity now to invest in UCITS or EUAFs. And I think the distinction is very important, that it's EUAFs, and those EUAFs must be managed by an EUAFM. So it's not a broad discretion to just allocate your ELTIF to a fund in the Cayman or another popular fund jurisdiction, but rather there is a requirement there that managers need to be aware of. One interesting point that's worth noting as part of these changes is that to the extent rather your ELTIF is targeting professional investors, a lot of those prior requirements that I've just mentioned, you get a derogation on those. So the borrowing limits have, as part of the ELTIF 2.0 rules, increased from 30 to 50. If you were to target professional investors, you essentially have a derogation on that 50% limit, and it's now increased to 100. The same applies to, again, the 30 and 20% requirements. which would generally apply provided the ELTIF is targeting retail investors. So yeah, quite a few interesting changes. And it's okay, maybe you want to just echo that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Maybe can we just go back on slide 7 quickly, just to come back to some of the other points. So fund of funds are fantastic. Master feeder, we will see whether that really attracts a lot of interest, because the master has to be an out of itself. What we see a lot is co-investments, co-investment ELTIFs as well. So that is interesting. If we go back on the pink slide, please, just before that one. So we have a few other things like definitions being clarified. We won't go into the detail, but there have been, yeah, we just listed them here. So some of the definitions which were a little bit strange in the past have been clarified. So for instance, real assets, there was a strange definition which referred to some policy objectives that has been taken out. Some of the thresholds of the assets for their eligibility have been taken out. Some other assets have been added. For instance, fintechs are now eligible. That is interesting. So there are a number of things which have just been brought, as I would call it, closer to reality or closer to the market. And certain of the things which in the past were a little bit like political thinking of legislators have come closer to the reality of asset managers. So that's great. We note here third country investment. So that is a very technical but very important point. In the past, there were certain requirements which created obstacles. For instance, if you have been in these situations, you will have noted then whenever, for some tax reasons, you invested in the US, you could not sell your ELTIF to Austrian investors, which is just nonsense, because of some drafting problems. Also, there has always been, since 2015, the question, well, can I do third country investment, or do I need to invest in the EU? You will see when you look into the text that there's, of course, a focus on investing or channeling money into the European real economy. But very helpfully, it has now been clarified beyond any doubt that an ELTIF can invest outside the EU under certain conditions, of course, like tax exchange of information. But it is even clarified that a majority of assets can be outside the EU. That has always been a point of doubt in the past. So now it's clear, and that is really helpful. So what else? You already touched on borrowing and the
we talked a little bit about the borrowing. We've talked about the look-throughs, and again the derogation that's now available if you specifically target professional investors. So just to recap again, you can now, under the new 2.0 rules, essentially have a fund-to-fund ELTIF, have a master ELTIF, have a feeder ELTIF, and also deploy strategies which contemplate co-investments. Maybe just to, Evie, if you could jump back to slide number 8 for us, please. There we go. Yeah, perfect. So again, maybe just, I mean, the definition of master and feeder again is defined, right? And you can see there that on the slide. So again, it's a feeder is essentially an ELTIF which contemplates investing 85% of its assets into another ELTIF. There are some requirements attached to that, in that the master ELTIF and the feeder ELTIF need to enter into an agreement. The scope of that agreement, I think, is a conversation that you need to have within your business, essentially. But again, one important point I'd like for you to take away from this is, again, the possibility to have a master and feeder ELTIF. And if we could just jump to the next slide, please. Okay. And then, yeah, just a word on some of the MiFID considerations.
Yes, so maybe let's take a quick look on the investor side, because we talked now about the asset side, all the eligible assets and so on. But I think one of the points that had been identified, and that is more on the pink slide again, but never mind. One point that also was identified as holding back ELTIFs is the investor side. So ELTIFs were considered not to be attractive neither to investors, retail investors, nor to distributors. So that was a big problem. If you remember, and if you looked at the ELTIF 1.0 legislation, you had like some thresholds for retail investors, specific tests, suitability tests, which were not the MiFID tests, to be done, like a number of pretty complicated operational things when you wanted to sell to retail investors. And I had pretty long discussions with distributors who said, okay, so how does that fit together with MiFID, together with whatever, like a well-informed investor test and so on, plus ELTIF? What do I need to do to sell that product to the market? So what we have now for retail investors is a pretty broad and general alignment to the MiFID rules, which is really helpful because then distributors just have one set of rules to apply. The special suitability assessment has gone away. These thresholds have gone away. And helpfully, in the past, investment advice was mandatory. It's still foreseen, but there's a possibility now for investors who want to invest, although the investment advice is negative or the suitability assessment says, oh, maybe you should not invest because that's a long-term product, they can overrule. So they can give an explicit consent and can say, look, I still want to invest into that ELTIF, and that is explicitly put into the regulation. But alongside retail investors, we also have professional investors, Ron.
Yeah, indeed. And so conceptually, when you think about putting together or structuring an ELTIF, again, there's certain rights afforded to you if you target professional investors specifically. So to Silke's point, and I think this ties nicely into, again, the uptake or the potential uptake, let's say, of the ELTIF product now under the 2.0 rules. So tangibly, essentially, you could, during the ramp-up period, have an ELTIF which solely targets professional investors, and then at a later point, so following the ramp-up, switch to targeting retail investors. And why would you do that? Again, due to the derogations which are afforded to you, right? So the increased leverage, the possibility to have a derogation on the diversification and concentration requirements, and again, with the expanded scope of qualified portfolio undertakings, that could be something that's very, let's say, useful for managers when looking at potential target funds to ramp their portfolios, again, within a finite period of time, and then pivoting to opening up that product to retail clients. One of the additional clarifications that we've seen as part of the 2.0 rules is the withdrawal, clarification on the withdrawal provisions. I think this has been a little bit of a pain for managers trying to assess, well, what is the date of acceptance that's attributed to a particular client? You know, is it the date the subscription agreement was signed? Is it a date an acceptance committee was held? What is that date? And the new rules essentially set up that it's the date of the signing of the subscription form. So that's pretty clear. It's in black and white, and I think alleviates some of the concerns around that.
Yeah, that was actually a point of discussion in the law-making process. So the retail investor withdrawal rate, it's like all these consumer protection rules that they have 2 weeks to reconsider their choice and to withdraw. In the old text, there was like an alternative starting point. In the first draft of the ELTIF 2.0 regulation, they even expanded that and said, okay, it's the entire subscription period plus 2 weeks, meaning that you would have had like 18, 20, whatever months where you didn't know how much money you would have had. So now, helpfully, they listened again to the industry and said, okay, it's 2 weeks from subscription date by that retail investor that they can withdraw, of course. In practice, you will still need to figure out what you're doing. If somebody is withdrawing 2 weeks after subscription, so probably you will wait with a capital call for that 2 weeks until you know how much money you really have to invest. But that is maybe another story. I think having that clarified, that is really helpful, because that was a big threat if everybody, because there's a financial crisis or whatever, would have withdrawn and you have like only half of your money you were expecting to have, that could very easily have affected your ELTIF product. So what else do we have? A number of structure, I would call it structure changes. in the past, if you've ever looked into an ELTIF, and if you wanted, I had pretty long discussions with the CSSF on parallel ELTIFs in a fund family, or skin in the game. Can managers put some money for alignment purposes and so on? So there has been a provision in the past which seemed to not allow that. I think we are very lucky that the CSSF had a very good understanding for the reality, and whenever we discussed these cases with the CSSF, they just got the point that an ELTIF as a parallel fund to other funds of the same manager makes a lot of sense. That skin in the game for managers is something that is really very much market standard, and it is required by investors, at least by institutional investors. So they had a very good understanding, and they, together with ALFI, with the industry, looked at the provisions and looked at what was really intended. So that is to avoid conflicts of interest. And in the past, even in Luxembourg, we have been able to set up some of these structures with parallel funds, including one ELTIF and so on. But it is really helpful to have that now clarified for everybody in the text, that parallel ELTIFs to other funds are possible, that manager investment is possible, like the employees of the manager that are actually managing the fund. And also it has been clarified that all asset classes can invest indirectly through SPVs, through aggregators, through plumbing type securitization vehicles and so on. That also has been a little bit put at doubt, because the indirect investments were mentioned only for one asset class in the past, not for all. And now that has also been clarified that it's absolutely allowed, again, as the CSF has accepted in the past. But if one looked only at the text, there were a few questions coming up. So I think all these points of putting the reality into the text are really helpful to create credibility and also reliability of the ELTIF text going forward.
Yeah, that's great, and I think you know, it also again just lends itself well to managers having a concrete, well, drawing a concrete view on what the interpretation of certain aspects of that text is, and if we now have a look at what the slide that's on the page on the screen, more specifically as it relates to the possibility of evergreen ELTIFs. And maybe just to dispel any misunderstandings around that, I mean, an ELTIF does remain finite in life. It is, you know, it does have an end. So in practice, an open-ended or evergreen ELTIF is one which simply just offers regular dealing points, opportunities for investors. I think just on that point, what we touched on earlier, again, ESMA's guidance, pending guidance, as it relates to what it means for a minimum holding period is very critical, right? It essentially will set out or prescribe how long a shareholder needs to hold his, her, or its interest in that product. And that has a direct impact on, again, what managers can bring to market, right, in terms of an ELTIF fund. Secondly, as well, what are the matching provisions, right? So what is the possibility for a manager to, again, satisfy those redemption requests as and when a client is requesting them during that life of a product. And last but not least, you know, and more generally speaking, I should say, what are the liquidity views of ESMA? Maybe just on again, the minimum holding period. You know, as it states there, it does not apply to feeder ELTIFs, right? So, so to the extent you are to establish an ELTIF, which is a feeder into a master, that would be excluded from that requirement. And then secondly, as well, you can of course promise a certain amount of liquidity or dealing within the fund, but there's an expectation that a manager is able to actually make good on that, and that will be something, you know, managers need to kind of contemplate or deal with their home regulators, right? So satisfying are providing satisfactory evidence to their home regulators that they have the appropriate liquidity management tools and capabilities in order to deliver on those dealing points, if you will. Anything to add from your side on that?
Yeah, no, I think it sounds technical, but it is again a major shift. So in the past, we had ELTIFs having by default a defined term of presumed like 10 plus years. Of course, there are already ELTIFs on the market which have like fixed 50, 60, 70 years, but that was not initially intended. And whenever you looked at the old regulation, you will see here the first point on the screen, there was some pretty strange requirement that when you allowed redemptions, like say you had every 2 years or every 5 years, you had a liquidity window and you were allowing redemptions in an ELTIF 1.0 ELTIF, you needed to make sure that within 12 months you could pay out that redeeming investor. If not, that single investor had a right, based on the European regulation, to ask the winding up of the fund. Of course, that's a huge threat if you have, I don't know, in an ELTIF, that's a retail product, if you have 150 investors and one is not paid back and asks for the winding up, the other 149 would be pretty annoyed, and that's even, in my personal view, in contradiction to corporate law when you have a corporate type ELTIF. So that provision didn't make any sense, and it was a big danger to any ELTIFs who wanted to have liquidity windows, liquidity tools. So that is a major shift. Is they just deleted that provision, that like one line in the regulation, which makes a whole shift. Also, when we were discussing all these things, of course, the RTS are still to come. We will see what ESMA is coming up with, and they are already looking into it. I know I've received a number of questions via LPEA and other instances on what ESMA is looking at. So they are working on it already, which is good. Probably we will see some draft text in the next few weeks or months. That's great. But it is a whole shift, because we were told that there's no problem to have 99-year ELTIFs or so. So very long-term ELTIFs, which are designed as, I think we called it when we discussed previously, an economically evergreen ELTIF, although you would still fix some end date and be it just for company law reasons. But you need to define term. But in reality, in the economic living of that ELTIF and in the investor experience, it will be like an open-ended or an evergreen ELTIF, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you know, just to kind of echo that, I mean, of course, the changes in the limits on the portfolio for the liquid and illiquid buckets certainly helps, right? So we go from, in the illiquid bucket, from a 70% requirement to 55%. From liquid, we go from 30 to 45. So that increase in the liquid bucket, if you will, I think will help to probably drive the interest in the number of economically evergreen ELTIFs that we see. So again, I think it's been noted by the European policymakers that you know, the market is looking for a product which yes, does give the opportunity for retail investors to participate in private market assets, but you know, without the appropriate tools, managers aren't able to deliver on that. So so again, a shift from 70 to 55 and from 30 to 45, I think is a significant one. And again, with some of the derogations that are afforded to professionals only ELTIFs, especially during the ramp up, that could be quite an interesting opportunity. With that, maybe just one word on matching. Maybe Abby, if you could jump to slide number 11, please. Yeah.
Just the one after that.
Yeah.
Yeah, here's the matching process. So that is a new tool. Not in reality, because funds that offer matching processes are already in the market, quite a few of them. But I think it's a new tool for the legislator. So I think unless I overlooked something at the first time, that the legislator in a fund law is trying to legislate the matching process. The idea is to kind of create a secondary market for ELTIFs who don't necessarily offer redemption rights, like a right that can be claimed, but they can, as a second tool, and with the warning that it's not a right you can claim, they can offer a matching process, and they can allow people to submit redemption and subscription wishes, if you like, and to match them in some kind of process which needs to be defined, which needs to be described, and which ESMA will also comment on. But that matching process could be an additional way of stepping in and out for ELTIFs and for mostly retail investors. So it could be very interesting. We will need to see what ESMA comes up with. So that is one of the big fields where they will probably need to give some thought to and come up with some kind of delegated regulation.
Nice.
I just saw we have a few questions.
Yeah, we have a few questions.
So why a professional institutional investor would go for an ELTIF at all? So I think there are a few reasons I've seen in the past, and maybe there are others developing in the future. So there is one incentive for solvency submitted institutional investors. For instance, if you're an insurance undertaking fall under the solvency rules, you have a more interesting solvency capital ratio if you invest in an ELTIF than in normal equity investments. Also, in certain countries, you can more easily create direct lending funds and sell them to your investors. That is more on the asset side, for instance. I think I heard that in the past about Norway, France, to some extent Italy, and so on. So you can create, since the loan origination activity is one of the eligible investment types for ELTIFs, you can do that across Europe, and you don't need to worry about banking monopoly in these countries. And that is very interesting. Direct lending funds are interesting to institutional investors, maybe also to retail, but that could be one reason why they would go into ELTIFs. There are a number of other things, like getting support from European Investment Bank and similar. You also have developing a bit like the label idea that ELTIFs are some good investments, positive for the economy, and so they start having a bit of a positive label attached. So yes, I agree that there are other possibilities to invest for institutional investors, but an ELTIF could be interesting nonetheless. So you're running through the other questions. Yeah. I was not able to talk and read at the same time. So what else do we have? Yes, we can share the slides, absolutely, and also happy to take any questions afterwards, no problem.
Sorry, we have a few questions coming in.
Yeah, thanks, by the way, for asking questions. That's great. So what
it says here, what's the best product to offer under?
Okay, so the type of like legal and regulatory regimes, what I'm seeing a lot right now, so I have started seeing, and I think that's the same on your end, a really big interest in the new ELTIF regime. And I think probably the regime or the structure I'm seeing most outside specific considerations would be a Part 2 fund, sometimes as a platform combining both ELTIFs and non-ELTIFs, sometimes only an ELTIF platform. Sometimes I'm seeing also RAIF ELTIFs. That is particularly interesting if you want to start either the fundraising with professional investors, as you said earlier, or if you want to start investing because you have some asset and the deal period is close to come to an end. So there could be reasons to start with an unregulated structure and go to the regulator afterwards. Of course, then you have the risk that you need to do any changes, but you can maybe foresee that you can have some kind of anticipated consents, especially when it's institutional investors. So I think I'm seeing most part 2 ELTIFs with some RAFE ELTIFs as well.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, there's been part 2s. There's also been ELTIF RAFEs, but although from a subjective point of view, kind of question the rationale for that. I think, I mean, the ELTIF at the end of the day is a product meant for retail clients. And one of the questions here is, why would a retail investor invest in a product which has, a very extended duration? But as mentioned, I think with the changes under the 2.0 regime, that stands to change, right? So managers will be able to start offering regular dealing points or regular liquidity within the ELTIFs. But that aside, I mean, of course, it gives retail investors an opportunity to participate in private markets. And I think that's, that is essentially the answer, right? I mean, there are not many alternatives that retail investors have otherwise. So this just gives them a direct exposure to private market assets. It's less burdensome for the MiFID advisory firms to then offer that product to a certain caliber of clients, or whether they're having to conduct the suitability tests on investors. So I think the purpose of the regulation from a management perspective is to allow for retail clients to participate in the private markets sector and assets. And it does a good job of that. Whether or not the product is offering long-term regular dealing points and regular liquidity or not is a separate conversation. But again, access is the most important objective here. Yeah.
I'm impressed by the number of questions.
Yes.
So I saw one flying through our screen that was real assets or real estate assets, and whether there's any specific sustainability requirement. So that goes back to a discussion that always came up under ELTIF 1.0. That is, there was that reference in the definitions of real assets being linked to the EU objective of sustainable and inclusive growth, something like that. So it has always come up, the question whether to invest in real estate, you need to have a specific sustainability focus. It has been clarified now after quite some discussions that this is not the case. And if you look into the recitals to the new text, it is even clarified that there are no specific ESG requirements for real estate investments. There has been an attempt in the ELTIF review lawmaking process to create a green ELTIF, or what I call a green ELTIF, with specific ESG requirements. At the end of the day, this was rejected, probably, and I agree with that thinking. It was too early to create a special regime alongside SFDR and taxonomy and so on for specific ELTIF ESG criteria. So they will review that, and I think the review period for that is 2 years. So in 2 years, they will look again at whether they want to create green ELTIFs as a special category with a special label. So far, that has gone away. It's just the normal SFDR and taxonomy rules applying here. So that is hopefully helpful.
Maybe another question here. Is there a requirement to define priorities regarding client ELTIF assets in course of the prospectus? I mean, yeah, I think it goes without saying. I mean, again, the let's say the eligible or qualified portfolio undertakings are defined, right, by law. So there's no doubt about that. So I mean, as far as specifying or prioritizing what are the planned assets of the ELTIF, I mean, I think that's a commercial decision, right, by a manager, depending again what that investment policy or the intended investment policy is. But the boundaries within which you can operate are already prescribed by the rules. So again, it's the 55 and 45 split, and then ensuring that the underlying assets are eligible investments.
And I think it also goes back to the general principle that it is a regulated product, and CSF would wish the descriptions of investment policy to be clear enough so that people can understand what they're buying. But of course, you can have like mixed private market ELTIFs, you can have specialized real estate, private equity, private debt, whatever ELTIFs. But if you have a mixed strategy, you have a mixed strategy, and you can describe that as a mixed strategy.
Let's see here. We have another question.
Now that one's interesting. When you have a fund-of-fund ELTIF and invest in eligible underlying funds, do these need to be fully invested in ELTIF eligible assets or follow?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, so in short, the question is to the extent you invest into, you have a fund-of-fund strategy, which is again investing into the broadened scope being UCITS or EU ELTIFs. You know, does the underlying fund need to essentially comply with the ELTIF eligible investment rule? Yeah, the answer is yes, right? So it's quite prescriptive. There's a few things in the regulations which managers will need to pay attention to, and we've touched on them earlier in the discussion. One is that it needs to be an EU ELTIF. It needs to be managed by an EU ELTIF. The target, assuming you do invest in an ELTIF, of course, the ELTIF needs to invest in eligible investments, so as prescribed, right, by the regulations. And then there's one particular requirement that I think is, you know, quite apparent from a manager perspective, and that is that the target UCI or the target fund should not hold more than 10% of its exposure, if you will, to other UCIs, right? So I think that's a key one, and it would be nice to have a prospectus or I don't know, funds out there which are ELTIF compliant EU ELTIFs that is specifically set out in their documentation that they cap their exposure or they comply with the ELTIF eligible investment rules. But unfortunately, again, that's not the case, and I think, you know, firms will just need to undertake the work to actually carry out those checks.
I think that was probably the reasoning behind that kind of look-through, to avoid circumvention, so that you invest in something that is clearly not eligible, I don't know, hedge funds or whatever, saying it's a target fund, but I think that was one of the ideas. I saw there's something about whether the market is ready in terms of technology. I think that's a fair point. I often hear sponsors that come from the institutional investor side being a little bit destabilized by having to deal with hundreds of retail investors doing KYC, answering investor queries, doing certain tax reportings for individuals and so on. So I see some solutions coming up. Yes, I don't think there's one market solution, but I think these things are being handled quite well by some actors out there on the market. Of course, yeah, that can improve. Coming back to also discussions like the common AML, DLT approach, but yeah, certainly we can improve.
It says here, if UCITS funds are now a QPU, does it fall within the 55 or I guess the 45? I think that's an interesting question. I think it depends on the UCITS. Yeah, I don't think there's necessarily
I think it's
it depends. I think it depends.
I think it's a very interesting question. I've asked myself the same question a few times. I would tend to take the view that it depends for what purpose that's what you're saying, for what purpose you're investing in that UCITS. If it's a UCITS where you have an investment horizon of whatever, 5 years, 10 years, because the underlying assets, although they're liquid and UCITS eligible, tend to produce better returns after 5 years or whatever, I think you could qualify it under the ELTIF eligible investment assets, like the long-term assets. If you buy your UCITS just to have like short-term liquidity, you would put it into the liquid assets bucket. So since it has been added, which is somehow counterintuitive because UCITS are liquid funds, why would you put them into the long-term assets?
Yeah.
I think it depends on what use you want to make of that usage, but you can put it into the long-term bucket, or you can use it for liquidity purposes. But very interesting question. I asked myself the same. So.
Yeah, and I mean, I think generally speaking, the one way to, I mean, obviously, you may well be aware of how a usage eligible investment is kind of defined, and it's generally a transferable security. It's listed on an exchange, traded regularly, so there's a public price for this. It could also be a deposit with a credit institution, so a money market. So I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I think it generally will depend.
There's another question here. Will ELTIF 2 be able to grant preferential treatments? Very interesting, because in the past many manager sponsors struggled with that strong prohibition to have preferential treatment. So to be clear, that only applies to ELTIFs sold to retail investors. So whenever you have an institution or professional only ELTIF or sub-fund that is reserved to professional investors, or, and that's new, a class that is reserved to institutional or professional investors, you can have your preferential treatment. It's only when you have retail investors in either your ELTIF or your sub-fund, ELTIF sub-fund, or in a class. So the class aspect that has been added. And in the past, we had many ELTIFs having professional classes and retail classes with different features. But in the past, it was considered that, at least by some, that the prohibition to have preferential treatment applied across the board. So within one legal ELTIF, being a sub-fund or a standalone. Now you can have professional only classes, and the preferential treatment prohibition for retail investor classes only applies at class basis. So when you have professional classes and retail classes, you still wouldn't have preferential treatment in the retail class, but in the professional investor class you can.
Cool. Then we have a question here about the anticipation of how the opt-in regime will work. Do you want to?
Yeah, I think it's a simple notification.
Yeah.
I had some discussions with the CSSF. I don't know if they're on this call. I understand it's a simple notification. So you would send an email or a letter to the CSSF saying, okay, here is the ELTIF you have just approved. I wish to benefit from the new rules. It's a simple notification. There should not be any, well, I think probably in reality, you have that possibility to opt in, of course, depending on what the new features are you wish to use. If you have a fund prospectus saying, I invest only 10%, and then in the future you want to have 20%, that's a change. You need to update your documentation. You need to notify investors, depending on what the change is. You may need to give them some notice period, but the right, this opt-in right as such is a notification. Then, of course, there are some consequences in practice to inform your investors of what you're doing.
Yeah, and I think for managers, that's maybe a more sensitive topic, right? Do I need to now go and update my fund documentation? Is it a material change? Yeah. Do I require consent? And especially, I think one thing that will, well, the industry does need to think about is, again, Esma's comments coming 9 months down the road, you could have launched the fund, it's in the market, and then there's a material change to essentially what you have set out in your fund documentation, right? So then it's more of a commercial decision, or maybe even already having discussions with your counsel to already take that into account, right? So those future changes coming, such that you're not, basically caught off guard, and then you do need to go out with material amendments to your fund documentation.
I think it very much depends on where you stand in your ELTIF launch process. If you're already close to getting CSF approval tomorrow, then maybe you will have to wait a bit to really update it. Mm-hmm. If you're in the process where you're drafting your fund documents right now and planning to submit in a month's time or 2 months' time, then I see already quite a number of sponsors building in the flexibilities they want to use, like allowing fund-to-fund investments or whatever, and already, baking it in to some extent, and also into the subscription documents, depending on really where you stand in your process. But I think it's absolutely possible to upgrade, and it should be not too burdensome. But of course, if you have promised certain things and then you go beyond, that is a normal process.
We have a question around passporting to retail investors. If documentation is in English, is there a requirement to provide local language marketing and information? I mean, yeah, look, I think anyway, if the fund documentation is in English, I mean, you are preparing PRIP kits, so it depends on what marketing documentation you're referring to. I mean, you have an obligation under the PRIPS regime, of course, to transcribe or convert into the local language. So if that's what you're referring to, then I mean, you still have your standard fund documents, but please bear in mind, I mean, you have PRIP kits and other kind of reporting obligations where you will anyway need to translate. Then we have another here.
Okay, something average management fee. Oh, that's that's difficult. I'm not sure I have a number from the top of my mind.
Okay.
What is the interest for retail investors?
I think we've covered this one.
Did we?
Yeah, we covered this one here. Tax harmonization.
Yes, I saw that earlier. So there is no tax harmonization yet, but maybe interesting news for the audience. So we had tried in 2015 to build a specific tax regime for ELTIFs. At that time, we were not successful, but I have had some calls in the last few weeks where it seems to now be maybe more acceptable. So I think we're looking into creating a special lighter tax regime for ELTIFs in Luxembourg, or for ELTIF investments into ELTIFs in Luxembourg. So hopefully there's some good news to come. You probably know that there are some lighter, there's some lighter taxation, for instance, in Italy for ELTIFs or Italian investors going into ELTIFs. So we're working on it. Maybe be prudent here, but it's on the radar.
Then will US retail investors be able to invest into ELTIF 2.0?
So that is maybe a larger question, and Ron, you're very happy to hear it, and I think there's at least one person on the line who also will be interested to it. So whether retail investors in various non-European countries can invest is a question of local law. What we will be trying to do with the various industry bodies is to try and reach out to local legislators. Like we have identified a few countries like in Asia, Switzerland, US would be interesting as well, to probably educate them a little bit of what the ELTIF is and what the safeguards are, and to hopefully convince them that they would allow local retail investors to also invest in ELTIFs. I think that could be very interesting, very nice feature. So yes, hopefully we will be successful with that, but that's planned.
Yeah.
And Stefan, we have many questions, but I think we've run out of time, right?
Yes, absolutely. Silke and Ron, really thanks a lot for taking up that challenge, for answering so many questions already. Yes, we absolutely understood that this vibrant crowd has and audience has really many more. That should be even continued in a second episode potentially. But for now, yes, that is what we had promised today. So a highlight of certain features, sharing your experiences and your view on that. So I think mission completely accomplished. And from the perspective of also of some members who would like to join this very nice committee you're both leading, meaning the regulated and unregulated structures here in Luxembourg, I think lots of traction to be seen and further great discussions to be, let's say, done via this channel and also with the other associations and the Invest Europe. So thanks a lot again for sharing your insights. Thanks for joining. And as usual, it will be then recorded and shared with you, dear members. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.